So obviously, we know now that what's happening in Ukraine is astonishing. I mean, to say the least, there are no words. There are reports coming in that Putin's army and air force are targeting civilians as they flee violence, and there are reports that 1 million people have already crossed the border trying to get away from the war in Ukraine. You're an immigration lawyer in two countries. You got to know two sets of rules and regulations. I want to talk to you generally about what the situation is in both the United States and Canada. And
Sure.
Since you're Canadian and since you're in Toronto, I guess we'll give your home turf home field advantage and start there.
Okay.
Tell us what's going on in Canada.
Sorry, sure. Well, let's start with a little background. Not since World War II have there been so many refugees in Europe. Like, we're talking more refugees than the refugees. Well, it looks like it's ballooning into a refugee crisis more serious than the World War II, post-World War II DP crisis that was around that a lot of our parents, grandparents, or whatever went through. Yeah. Meaning, back then, there were millions of people in DP camps back then, displaced persons camps, and they had to be sponsored to come over to North America or to Australia or Argentina or wherever you have it. Now, there's, according to the most recent estimate that I got from the UN, was 1.5 million refugees, Ukrainians, in Eastern Europe, outside of Ukraine. But I can easily see, and I wrote an article for Forbes. I write Forbes articles on immigration. Before this crisis broke out, I quoted the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I believe it was, or Defense, one or the other. I guess it was the Minister of Defense, who said that he was projecting that somewhere between 3 and 5 million people would become refugees if Ukraine was invaded. And that projection looks pretty promising in terms of what's going to happen unless the war can be stopped.
Well, we're almost more than a third of the way there, and it's been a week. Yeah. And by the way, I'm going to take a link. I'm going to put a link to that article below the description of this video.
Good, good. So that's the deal. Now the question is, what are we going to do with this magnificent number of people, and how are we going to resettle them and make something out of this? Not to mention the destabilization of Europe that it could cause. We're early in the game. Right now, the world is with us. There's a lot of goodwill. They're helping. This is a moment when we're seeing the worst of humanity, but also the best of humanity in terms of the crisis in Ukraine, the bombing and the stuff you talked about, and the best of humanity in terms of the response of Poles, Hungarians, the Baltics, all of Western Europe, not to mention the United States, Canada, and other countries, and Israel, and everybody backing what's going on and helping the people in this humanitarian crisis. It's tremendous, tremendous world support for Ukraine. So that's the context. And now we got to talk in our conversation here about what can be done in terms of Ukrainian immigrants to Canada and Ukrainian immigrants to the United States. Let's start with you, Canada, as you suggested. Let me give you a little rundown. The basic approach I advocate at this moment is come to Canada as a visitor, particularly if you have a family member who can sponsor you to come as a visitor to Canada. The current rules for visitors coming to Canada are the same as they are for anybody else coming to Canada. Ukrainians are no different at this moment, other than there's been an expression of sympathy and the desire to expedite anybody who's applying for visitors visas to Canada by the government. There are some touchy points. A visitor is someone who comes to a country, but then leaves the country at the end of the period of authorized stay. And we're addressing that issue by saying, if you're a visitor to Canada, you're Ukrainian, it's likely you're coming temporarily because you want to return back to Ukraine once things stabilize. And so you're going to say, I'm coming for the time being to Canada, and because I have a family member or close associate who is going to support me while I live there for the time being, until things settle, and then I will return back to Ukraine.
Well, you bring up
Which
an
I think,
interesting point, if I can ask you a question about
sure,
that.
go
So
ahead.
I don't want to skip ahead too far because I want to ask you, when we get to the United States, I have a feeling that you might be talking about similar routes to the United
It's
States
going
for
to be
immigrants.
very similar to what I'm talking about right
Right. So I just want to bring up an interesting point. You're saying that the intention of the immigrant or the person traveling as a visitor to the United States or Canada, in this case, Canada, is with the intention of eventually returning home. Now, there's some policy changes that were executed by the president recently that we'll get to in the United States.
now. Yes,
And I
yeah,
want to I want to maybe dive a little bit into that when we get there about,
yeah,
making sure that people know or have accurate information about how to do that.
yeah. That's called TPS, and we're going to come to that.
Okay.
But what I'm talking about for Canada right now, this area that we're talking about right now, identical in the US. The requirements are the same, and I'll just cover them briefly for US in a moment. But so the key element is going to be this issue about, do you have intent to stay here permanently? Because if you do, you can't be a visitor. So we have to address that by saying, yeah, well, I'm coming as a visitor because it's my intention to return home. And the authorities, there's great goodwill right now in the authorities in both countries, and I think they're ready to accept a fairly reasonable request of a visit with the idea that the person is intending to go back. They're not going to go crazy on us. So now, unfortunately, in the US situation, recently there have been a few denials by US officials of people who have come and applied as visitors. But it's likely because these people did not know about this thing we're talking about right now, which is saying something about, well, I've got a life back in Ukraine. I've got a house, I've got a wife, I've got or a husband, I'm sorry, or I've got a dog, or I've got a job, or I've got whatever it is that I'm looking to return to. If you don't have any of that, then the chances of getting in could be, turned down. You could get turned down.
So they want to look as though, I mean, that obviously they're doing this in good faith, but they want to show that they don't have an intention of overstaying the visa. In fact, they don't have an intention of abandoning whatever it is that they left behind.
That's a very good way of putting it. I would put it this way, like you just said, but I'm going to word it the same way, but a little different. They're going to abide by the law. Whatever the law requires, they will abide by it. But they're asking to come as a visitor for the time being. Now, the key is there's got to be a family member, preferably a family member, even a distant one, a cousin, uncle, aunt, or whatever. Better if it's a father, husband, wife, son, daughter. But whatever it is, there's got to be a family member inviting them to come in, because that family member can say, look, I'll give this person a place to stay. I'll look after them. I'll provide them food and shelter. I'll look after their expenses while they're here. And that will relieve the American or the Canadian government official who's looking at the application from any apprehension about, well, this guy's going to show up and then what? Right straight on to welfare, right? They don't want that. So these are the circumstances right now, both for Canada and the US in terms of visiting. And that is the quickest way for anybody from Europe to get into Canada or the US. I recommend it.
And these are not refugees, right? This is not a visa for refugees.
Okay. The people are all refugees as we understand them in common parlance, but they're not a refugee claimant for purposes of coming to the country. Do not claim refugee status on arrival. I would advocate against that. It's complicated. It's a developing situation in terms of Ukraine. But listen, you can claim refugee status once you're inside the country as well. It's not like you're precluded from claiming refugee status. There are benefits to refugee claims that are not available to ordinary visitors. In the Canadian case, the government has agreed that if the person comes as a visitor, they will be eligible to get a work permit. So that's another reason why you should come as a visitor. But you won't get health care, which is something you would get if you're a refugee claimant, as well as a work permit if you're a refugee claimant in Canada. In the American situation, there's no right to a work permit. There's no right to any health care. If you're coming as a visitor, you got to look after yourself, buddy, or someone's got to look after you. So be it. Okay. So anyway, thank you for allowing me to sort of kind of skate over this area. But that's the key message I want to leave with people is now's the time to apply for a visitor's visa to Canada or the United States. And if you'll allow me to just give me a few more minutes, I want to explain particularly why now is the time. Even though, for example, in Canada, the Canadian government has announced that it's going to relax the restrictions on visitors coming to Canada. And in about 2 weeks or so, we're going to hear all the details about a relaxed visitor's visa option for people. But despite that fact, I think it's important both for Canada and the United States for people to apply now and not later for several reasons. Number one is the world is on our side. Right now, Ukrainians are well received anywhere. There is some criticism. There's a building backlash against Ukrainian refugees by other people who are saying, I've been in the line for 2, 3, 4, 5 years waiting. Why should these guys be able to get right through there right away? Or I'm from Palestine, we've been mistreated all this time. Why should these people get the permission to, stuff like that? And there's some, those are not unreasonable criticisms, although just the case, if I may make it for the Ukrainian side, forgive me, my phone is ringing. I'm not going to answer it.
All right.
Maybe I can put it on. Okay, there we go. Briefly, the argument for why Ukrainians are entitled now or should be treated better than, say, some of the others at the moment there's two of them. One is Ukraine is being attacked by a nuclear power after having surrendered its nuclear weapons to that power on the promise that the Russians would respect its integrity, its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and on the assurances made by the United States, the UK, and lesser but still assurances of France and China that this was in Budapest, that if Ukraine surrendered 5,000 nuclear weapons, both strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, that Ukraine's sovereignty would be respected. And now they're being crushed by that nuclear power. There's no other community of refugees who can say that. That's number one. And number two, for 75 years, Ukrainians in the United States and Canada and elsewhere were cut off from their family members in the Soviet Union, unable to sponsor any of them because of the Iron Curtain. And we were severely disadvantaged in terms of being able to bring over close relatives for that period of time. The doors were closed, not for everybody else, but for Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans who were behind the Iron Curtain. So this is an opportunity to at least catch up a bit on that loss of 75 years worth of sponsorships of family members. And by and large, the people who are coming will have family. The initial ones will probably have family members in North America. So we're catching up. Those are two reasons why this immigration, the Ukrainian refugee immigration, should, in addition to just world sentiment, have some resonance in terms of immigration treatment at this moment.
Now, of course, and I'm sorry to interrupt. Of course, governments all have limited resources, but if there are legal paths for anyone, regardless of where they're coming from, they should take advantage of them. And there's no reason why Ukrainians shouldn't do the same, or people from Ukraine shouldn't do the same.
That's a good point. It's a good point. We're not trying to disobey the law. We're not sneaking in. These Ukrainians are coming lawfully the way the rules require them to come. So, but let me just again on the timing, get this timing issue through this timing issue with you. So I mentioned the sympathy that the world has for Ukrainians now as one factor. Another factor is the longer you wait, the more there will be people applying. And the more people apply, the longer the waiting times. What was something, for example, in the Canadian case that could be done in 2 days in our initial applications are now taking like 2 weeks to get done. And this is early in the game. I anticipate long backups. For example, biometrics is one of, getting fingerprinted, and security clearance is one of the steps you have to go through in order to get into Canada or the United States. Getting an appointment to get your fingerprints done is now taking 2-3 weeks. And until you get that done, you won't get your visa. So already there's a lineup of people, and this is early in the game. And the longer we wait, and the more people pour out of Ukraine, if it's 3 to 5 million people, that backlog is going to backlog the whole works of, so now, for those reasons, is the time to apply. Even if it's more difficult, say in the Canadian case, even though 2 weeks from now, it may be easier to get a visitor's visa to Canada than today, I would say that today is a better time to apply for Ukrainians than even 2 weeks or longer from now. The sooner the better. That's for everybody. Anyway, that's the whole subject of visitors.